The Prime Minister said emergency Western food aid for the Soviet Union will be sent direct to the republics. With it will go what Mr. Major called lifeline teams to check on Soviet food production and distribution, but there'll be no extra cash. Mr. Major, who's with President Bush in the United States, stressed that further help was conditional on economic reform and lower spending on defence.
His vice president signed a pact with the Ukraine this morning, and he's now in Kazakhstan. Tonight we examine this latest turn in the unravelling of the Soviet Revolution and assess the further damage it's doing to the credibility of President Gorbachev, whose attempt in the Soviet parliament today to boost his central power earned him a smart rebuff. We'll get the latest measure of the power struggle from a leading parliamentarian who watched today's debate. We examine the approach of President Bush and Prime Minister Major to the challenge of rescuing the Soviet economy. And how long will Lenin stay tucked up in his mausoleum? The historian Alan Bullock tells us anything is possible in a revolution where no icons are sacred. And the genetic revolution in medicine. Should parents have the right to perfect designer children? Another fast-moving day in Moscow. The Supreme Soviet has taken President Gorbachev's advice and suspended the Communist Party. And the new defense minister has announced that he's calling off 3 nuclear tests that were due to take place this week. But the most significant moves today have been by the government of President Yeltsin's Russian Republic. In a series of moves that appear to further marginalize what's left of President Gorbachev's central Soviet government, the Russians are out to sign their own separate pacts with the other republics. And they started today with the Ukraine. Even as the Supreme Soviet was approving today's new pact, word got about that Russia's President Yeltsin was in the newly independent Republic of Latvia. The name of the game now is deals between republics. And the most important, between Russia and the Ukraine, was signed early this morning. The Russian delegation had a hostile reception when they arrived in Kiev last night. Their leader, Boris Yeltsin, had, after all, threatened to raise the issue of where the frontier ran between Ukraine and Russia. But by this morning, they had a pact. It talked of the inability of the state and union structures to guarantee the vital interests of our people. And it suggests that member states of what it calls the former Soviet Union should sign a mutual economic agreement and create a collective security system. But outside, the crowd still had its doubts. Give us an independent Ukraine, they chanted. Down with Russian imperialism.
Russia is big brother. It's no good, no.
No sooner had Russia's vice president signed up with the Ukraine than he was off to the third most important Soviet republic, Kazakhstan, apparently to do the same kind of deal there. Kazakhstan's President Nazarbayev called on all 15 republics to form what he called a common economic space by next Monday. And he warned Russia that its talk of questioning frontiers made his republic as nervous as the Ukraine. Special danger lies in the fact that Kazakhstan is a nuclear republic, he said. Meanwhile, the man in the center is fighting back as best he can. In the Supreme Soviet today, Mr. Gorbachev had a go at drafting a group of top liberals onto his Central Soviet Security Council. Sobchak, the mayor of Leningrad, Popov, Moscow's mayor, and Alexander Yakovlev, his former propaganda chief.
Яковлева Александра Николаевича, Попова Гаврила Харитоновича, мэра Москвы, Собчака Анатолия Александровича, мэра Ленинграда.
On top of those, he added Edward Shevardnadze, the former foreign minister who promptly declined the offer. But the snub to the Soviet president was even worse than that. The Supreme Soviet voted down his nominations, saying that he should have consulted the republics first. And they removed the emergency powers they'd voted him last year. So Mr. Gorbachev's attempt to row back from the humiliation he suffered in the Russian parliament last Friday has been uneven. Then it looked as if Boris Yeltsin was walking all over him. Since then, Russia's president has stepped back a little, clearly sensitive to other republics' fears of Russian imperialism, and recognizing that Mr. Gorbachev and the center do have a role to play. In a radio broadcast today, Yeltsin said,
"The idea of the Union is not exhausted. There's a great striving to create a new, really free, really voluntary union of sovereign and, I stress, equal states."
He went on to say that the forces which had rejected the orders of the junta last week should remain the United Armed Forces of the Union. He also said any division of the strategic nuclear weapons amongst the republics would be an additional threat to peace. Well, now, one parliamentarian watching the Supreme Soviet's debate today was Professor Vyacheslav Ivanov. He's also a leading intellectual in Moscow. Professor, looking at that debate today, whose side would you say the Supreme Soviet's on? Clearly not on Mr. Gorbachev's, but presumably not on Mr. Yeltsin's either, because they rejected all the radicals.
You know, I think that now Mr. Gorbachev is changing his attitude towards radicals, towards Democrats, and what was important today was his official announcement that he would like to cooperate with Mr. Sobchak, Mr. Popov, and Mr. Yakovlev.
But why did the Parliament say no to them on the Security Council?
You know, I think that still the majority in the Supreme Soviet is rather reactionary, and it is no surprise. The Supreme Soviet was chosen from a more reactionary part of the Congress of People's Deputies, and even after that there were some changes and some more democratic deputies were substituted by reactionary people, and so now we have to deal with extraordinary reactionary body with only few exceptions in it.
To sign pacts with the other republics?
You know, I think it is necessary now because as a result of the defeat of the military coup, Russia has evidently the role of the previous center. So Mr. Yeltsin, in a sort, is becoming not only the most popular, but the most important political leader, and Russia is becoming really the dominating republic, which causes some fear on the part of other republics. It is necessary to establish quite legal relations between all republics.
So is there a sense, do you think, in which Mr. Yeltsin has sort of rode back a little in the last few days to reassure the other republics?
Yes, I think that his first announcement about the frontiers was maybe not too cautious, and so now he and his deputy, his vice president, Mr. Rutskoy, and other people of his team are trying to reassure other republics that no danger can be seen in Russian political tendencies.
This is clearly an extremely important issue, this question of the frontiers, and this very nervous relationship between the future most dominant of the republics, Russia, and the other ones. I wonder if you could just give us your assessment of whether you think this can be achieved, this relationship between these republics, without serious popular unrest.
I hope that it is yet possible. You know, we should not waste time, because, of course, later it would be more dangerous. So now we should establish, we should preserve very good relations as they were before this conflict came quite recently. And so I hope that now it's just the time to sign treaties and, in general, to reassure everybody that no danger of changing frontiers exists.
But the puzzle still remains, while all these discussions and negotiations go on with the republics on the part of Russia, what role remains for Mr. Gorbachev? Now, I mean, where do you think he fits in? Clearly, Mr. Yeltsin still sees a role for the center, but how much of a role for the center of Mr. Gorbachev?
You know, the main problem is how much is left of the Soviet Union as a special center. We have now practically independent republics as Baltic republics and semi-independent republics and republics striving for independence. And we have only relics of the huge system of all union institutions, because now practically we do not have our vice president of the union, we don't have any government, and we don't have general attorney since this day. So many important institutions are lacking, and still life goes on. So it's possible to live without these institutions, which is remarkable.
What is, finally, then, the best word to describe the likely relationship between the republics? A confederation? How would you describe it?
Yes, I think that we need only some committees that should be established to regulate financial, defense, transport problems, but maybe we don't, in the near future, maybe in some months, we will not need any particular all-union government. That is, the system of huge establishments with ministers, several tens of them, is not necessary anymore.
Professor Ivanov, thank you very much for joining us. Now, one aim of last night's deal signed between Russia and the Ukraine was to begin the process of replacing the centralized command economy with market principles. The two sides moved quickly because they're worried that economic chaos might cause a catastrophic famine this winter. The potential slide into chaos occupied the minds of John Major and George Bush during their holiday discussions in Kennebunkport.
Our judgment is that what the Soviet Union and the republics most need is emergency humanitarian assistance, practical help in converting their economy into one that works.
The biggest threat to political stability in the Soviet Union. Now the coup is over, Muscovites can get back to traditional pursuits like queuing for scarce basic commodities. A stark reminder that tearing down the old communist icons doesn't fill the shelves. Real inflation in the Soviet Union has been estimated by the World Bank as 140%. GDP output is expected to fall by up to 20% this year, whilst oil production is falling by 15%. The failed Soviet system was based on economic interdependence between the republics, centrally planned from Moscow. Under this system, republics specialized in different products. For example, although oil is produced in Siberia, most oil drilling equipment is manufactured 2,000 miles away in Azerbaijan. And the center's relationship with the Asian republics is sheer colonialism. Uzbekistan is forced to export low-value cotton in return for high-value food products from the Ukraine and Russia. Unraveling this structure will lead to a further problem. Russia will end up the overwhelmingly dominant economic power, towering over the old Union. It produces 60% of the Soviet Union's output, accounts for 63% of energy production, and 55% of steel output. The problem is that in the existing Union, Russia sells this to the other republics at cut prices. Imagine the chaos and suffering it will cause if Russia now charges world market prices for these vital commodities. But even if the republics work out trading deals between them, how viable will their industry be in the face of Western competition? Without the discipline of the market, much of Soviet manufacturing is hopelessly uncompetitive. Inferior goods on overmanned production lines use out-of-date technology. And if they can't sell their products, then they won't be able to buy either. No doubt then about the enormity of the challenge facing Mr. Major when he goes to Moscow this weekend. But there's confusion and disagreement within the West as to just how to help. Officials of the Group of 7 industrial nations have been trying to sort it out in London today, and our economics correspondent Graham Ingham takes the measure of their task.
It's 6 weeks since the Sherpas, who represent the G7...
The old state-controlled system have proved disastrous so far. Deliveries are haphazard, supplies are cornered for the black market, the huge queues are a part of daily life. Now the Ukraine is taking matters into its own hands. It is printing its own currency, due to be brought into circulation after a referendum to approve the republic's independence in December. A system of coupons has been introduced already, so that only Ukrainians can buy basic foodstuffs here. The republic is an important supplier of agricultural produce, coal and heavy machinery for the rest of the Soviet Union. But it is no longer prepared to channel its dealings through the central authorities.
Even a republic like this, with an abundance of raw materials, needs to trade with its neighbours. Ukraine has long resented Moscow's control over its resources. And with the old Soviet structure now in tatters, it is determined to build new agreements with the republics without any reference to a central government.
At a news conference today, the Ukrainian president said he wanted a loose alliance of independent nations like the European community.
There will not be a union. There will be a different structure similar to the European community. Economic, military and strategic ties will continue. They must continue. But they will be in a very different form.
Preparations are underway for the removal of the huge Lenin memorial in the center of Kiev. This symbol of Soviet communist ideology is made of marble and granite with a steel core which goes deep into the ground. It will take considerable strength and skill to uproot it. Carol Walker, BBC News, Kiev.
Boris Yeltsin has been to the Baltic Republic of Latvia in his capacity as President of the Russian Federation. He met Latvia's President, Mr. Gorbanov's republics, after another two joined the independence bandwagon. All the others, except Russia, which is in any case now run by Boris Yeltsin, have made the break with the Kremlin or declared their intention to secede. Today it was the turn of Uzbekistan in Central Asia and Kyrgyzstan, the new name for what used to be Kyrgyzia. Neighbouring Tajikistan has yet to make the move, but nationalist deputies have forced its president to resign. With 9 other republics already committed to independence, no one seems surprised that the Russian Prime Minister, Ivan Silyev, today turned down President Gorbachev's invitation to be Prime Minister of a Soviet Union that exists in little else but name.
Mr. Gorbachev was in the thick of the crowds today, celebrating Moscow's annual festival with the city's mayor. But the Soviet leader is rapidly becoming the loneliest man in the country. Mr. Gorbachev's nominee as his new vice president, Askar Akayev of Kyrgyzia, today refused to work with him. And his acting prime minister, Ivan Silayev, has now said he won't take the job permanently, joining leading liberals who yesterday snubbed Mr. Gorbachev's offer of senior positions. Even the usually loyal Muslim republics are deserting the president, with Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzia in Soviet Central Asia declaring themselves independent democratic states. 11 of the 15 republics have now stated their intention to leave the Union. In Moscow this morning, the end of communist power was formally marked by a ceremony in Gorky Park. Statues of former socialist heroes dumped on the grass and officially declared an open-air museum of Bolshevism, with the mayor of Moscow suggesting that Lenin himself will soon be removed from his mausoleum and given a proper burial.
We're putting a full stop at the end of an era, so people can clearly see what we've lived through and can now begin a new life.
One relic of the past did come back today, though, Pravda resuming publication after a temporary ban imposed by Boris Yeltsin. Now no longer the mouthpiece of the Communist Party, and with its editorial board completely replaced, Moscovites are hoping Pravda will finally live up to its name, which in Russian means truth. Boris Yeltsin's vice president, Alexander Rutskoy, was hosting celebrations outside the Russian parliament today, commemorating the thousands who came to defend the building against the tanks, while Yeltsin himself was absent in the Baltics, continuing his mission to win support for his vision of a new confederation of republics. At the graves of the 3 civilians killed during the coup, a popular shrine has grown up to the victims of a revolution which has turned Soviet values on their head. When John Major comes to Moscow tomorrow, he'll lay his wreath not at the Soviet Army's eternal flame, but at the spot where 3 young men were killed by its tanks. Martin Sixsmith, BBC News, Moscow.
President Bush has indicated that the United States may soon formally recognize the 3 Baltic republics. He said he had spoken on the telephone to the Lithuanian president, Vytautas Landsbergis, and told him he would probably have something to say on Monday of great interest to the people there. Meanwhile, troops controlled by the Soviet Interior Ministry have begun withdrawing from Latvia and Lithuania.
7 Lithuanian border guards were killed here a month ago by Soviet Interior Ministry troops, the OMON. Today, the borders are under complete Lithuanian control, the country honoring those who died in the final weeks before independence. In Vilnius, the parents of the young man shot as he helped defend the parliament last week today set up their own small memorial. It sits next to barricades which the Lithuanians are still cautious about dismantling. Even the government hasn't been too sure what the unpleasant troops of the aoun have been up to. Supposedly under army control in Vilnius barracks, there were explosions and shots there in the early hours of this morning. No one's come up with a reasonable explanation. However, it is now accepted that more than half of these troops and their families finally cleared out later today, leaving for Russia. The rest are being disbanded. A necessary reassurance for the Lithuanians in an atmosphere of rumor. It is suggested by Soviet soldiers that there's considerable desertion as uncertainty hangs over the army's future. Even so, it's noticeable that the tension has eased considerably, with independence a reality and a long procession of foreign diplomats and politicians expected here next week. Kate Adey, BBC News, Vilnius, Lithuania.
In the Ukraine, which declared independence from Moscow a week ago, the Communist Party has been banned because of its role in the failed coup against President Gorbachev. And the Ukrainian president, Leonid Kravchuk, has warned against what he called a new Tsarist empire if the Russian Republic tried to expand its borders.
Beneath the condemned figure of Lenin, the vigil is cheerful and irreverent. The founder of communist ideology is the butt of political satire, and the people are delighted. Convinced that independence will enable them to profit from the Ukraine's wealth of natural resources at last.
All goods which are produced in our republic, these goods will go to our people. And I think our shops will be rich and good and beautiful.
I figure in the future Ukrainian gonna be first in a line of first countries in Europe and prosperity and everything in a short time.
But the rise in Ukrainian nationalism has not pleased the Russian minority here.
Not very happy, because I'm Russian. I'm not Ukrainian, and I think that I'm afraid.
And the Ukraine, in its turn, fears the ambitions of its Russian neighbor.
There's a concern that this great Russian nationalism can result in a desire to recreate the old Tsarist empire. And there's a danger this could lead to increased tension.
Ukraine's Republican Party today accused Russia of rampant chauvinism. Carol Walker, BBC News, Kiev.
Prospects for a ceasefire in the Yugoslav Republic of Croatia improved this evening when Serbia accepted a European Community peace plan.
As two more republics declared their independence from the Kremlin. It brings the total number of breakaway republics to 10. Only 5 now remain under tight control from Moscow. The latest republics to declare independence are the Soviet Central Asian republics of Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan.
As Mikhail Gorbachev strolled through Moscow today with its radical mayor Gavril Popov, the city was celebrating the collapse of last week's coup. A Red Army choir sang at Boris Yeltsin's Russian parliament, the focus of resistance to the attempted military takeover. But as the crowds rejoiced, Mr. Gorbachev's problems continued to mount. Russian Prime Minister Ivan Salayev reportedly said no to the Soviet premiership, preferring to remain Boris Yeltsin's right-hand man. And in Muslim Central Asia, 2 more republics, Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, declared their independence. The Uzbeks said they feared the growing influence of the Russian Republic. That echoes the view of the Ukrainian leader Leonid Kravchuk. He signed a treaty with the Russians this week, but has now warned about what he calls their superpower chauvinism. One Russian with cause for optimism, Leila Gordievsky, wife of the KGB agent Oleg Gordievsky, who defected to Britain. Tomorrow she'll meet visiting Prime Minister John Major and his wife Norma, another reason to hope she'll soon be allowed to join her husband. Former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher stopped in the Soviet Union ahead of Mr. Major tonight. She was en route to Japan. She met Nursultan Nazarbayev, president of Kazakhstan, one of the few republics to remain loyal to the old Union. Mr. Nazarbayev is a proponent of radical economic reform. and viewed as a key mediator between the centre and the republics.
I am as anxious as the President that we start to build the new Soviet Union, the new republics, so that the people really can see a better way of life.
Outside the Kremlin, meanwhile, rock bands and ecstatic crowds continue to celebrate the rebirth of democracy. Tim Ewart, ITN, Moscow.
In the United States, President Bush has hinted that he'll recognize the independence of Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia on Monday.
Leaders of 10 of the Soviet republics have put forward a plan that would change the Soviet Union into a loose federation of sovereign states. They presented it today to the Congress of People's Deputies, the supreme lawmaking body in the country, who gave it conditional approval. It would leave the Kremlin running little more than defence and foreign affairs, but prevents the total disintegration of the Union that many deputies fear. They approved a new union treaty. Republics can decide whether or not to join and on what terms. Economic cooperation, a free trade zone for those that join. A military agreement, united armed forces. Independent status for the republics. They'd even be allowed to join the United Nations. For now, there'll be a transitional government, a new Council of People's Deputies, on which all the republics will have an equal say. And a state council, President Gorbachev plus one representative from each republic to deal with foreign policy and issues that affect the Union as a whole.
The flag was still flying, but some distinctly anti-Soviet delegates were coming to the Congress. This system, he says, made people crawl, and now, with their own hands, they're going to pull its head off. Inside the Congress, one head was already missing, Lenin's. For probably the first time since his death in 1924, his portrait was gone from behind the dais. The dominant color wasn't even red. The leader of Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev, came up to read a statement which effectively outlined the end of the old Soviet Union. He read a statement which had been agreed not long before dawn by Mr. Gorbachev and the heads of the 11 most important republics, including Boris Yeltsin of Russia. The statement called for the signing of a treaty which would act as a framework for a new union, but it was up to each republic how or if they chose to be a part of it. Any republic, which meant the Baltic states, but also any others that might want total independence, would have the support of the new union in joining the United Nations. When the statement was finished, there was an outburst from the supporters of the old Soviet Union and the old Marxist-Leninist line, claiming this was dictatorship.
This is an anti-constitutional coup. Let's act according to our responsibilities.
How can you behave like that? I don't know what's to be done with you.
They're a grim-looking bunch, but they're political lightweights. If there'd been serious figures, they'd have been involved in the coup, and they'd be under arrest by now. Over lunch, the delegates discussed the position. Many of them felt the proposals didn't go far enough. Nevertheless, what's happened is that Moscow is offering to give up its Soviet empire and turn it into a kind of commonwealth, almost along British lines, where the republics can run themselves. When they came back, delegation after delegation spoke in broad agreement with the statement, though most had reservations of some kind. There wasn't a vote on it today, nor on the question of independence for the Baltic states. Lithuania and Estonia weren't represented here anyway, but the Latvians were gracious. The Latvian government, he said, looks forward to friendly relations with the new Soviet Union. He spoke as though independence had already arrived. The relative success of the proposals so far is due to their vagueness, the fact that they mean virtually all things to virtually all people. One Lithuanian I spoke to said that they were a way for the supporters of the old system to save face while allowing everyone else to do precisely what they wanted. There was wide agreement that the new union should control defense. General Moiseev, who was very briefly defense minister before being sacked on Saturday, insisted this new structure would prevent any unsanctioned use of nuclear weapons. It's by no means over yet, but there's no mistaking the feeling by the man whose future depends on an agreement here that things went reasonably well today.
The very fact that the day began with 11 republics sitting down together at such a sensitive and troubled time, when the process of disintegration is gathering pace, is itself of enormous importance.
But he's having to give a great deal away, almost everything that would have mattered to past Soviet leaders, in order to prevent the Union from disappearing altogether. John Simpson, BBC News, Moscow.
The new Soviet Foreign Minister, Boris Pankin, today warned that many dangers await everybody if the Soviet Union disintegrates into separate states. Like many others, he's worried about ethnic tensions in the republics which may explode into violence. From Moscow, Carol Walker reports.
Fighting has intensified in the past 2 days along the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan. As the independent republics seek to wrest power from the center, disputes like this may multiply. The many peoples of the Soviet Union do not live neatly in their respective republics. Both Armenians and Azerbaijanis live in and around Nagorno-Karabakh. Both sides claim parts of the territory. The central authorities are increasingly excluded.
The conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh must be resolved by the Armenian and Azerbaijan.
1,000 people protested in Lvov against signing a new union treaty. The republic is forming its own army. The many Russians living there are decidedly nervous. Nationalist fervour is sparking considerable tension across a country with more than 170 different ethnic groups. Carol Walker, BBC News, Moscow.
The United States has now recognized the independence of the Baltic states. President Bush denied that he'd been slow to establish diplomatic ties and said other republics would be assessed case by case. The Baltic states were incorporated into the Soviet Union.
The country's main lawmaking body voted through his plans for a new way of running the country. They agreed to work on a new treaty for those republics which want to stay together as a union of sovereign states and to reduce the Kremlin's power.
The red flag was still fluttering above the Kremlin tonight, but the Soviet empire it symbolized was no more. In the Hall of Congress, Mikhail Gorbachev was celebrating a stunning political transformation with men who have voted themselves out of a job. And Boris Yeltsin was contemplating what will undoubtedly be a leading role for him in the new power structure. Barely 2 weeks ago, there were tanks on the streets of Moscow. Mr. Gorbachev was a prisoner in his home in the Crimea. Mr. Yeltsin was cast in the mold of resistance leader. And the Soviet Union seemed poised to revert to the old days of central dictatorship. Today, the system the coup leaders sought to restore was dismantled in a series of constitutional amendments which hand power and freedom to the republics. Mr. Gorbachev bullied a reluctant Congress of People's Deputies into submission. Last night, he sent them home to consider their future. This morning, he warned them, if we can't agree on this, the Congress will cease its work. In the end, only 43 said no on the crucial vote, and Mr. Gorbachev had won the day. That's it, he said.
It's absolutely new chapter in the history of Great Russia. I suppose this event is the most important event in the history of that great country for centuries.
Anatoly Sobchak, radical mayor of Leningrad, proposed the body of Lenin should now be moved from its mausoleum in Red Square. But Mr. Gorbachev ruled the decision on that should be taken by the new parliament. The symbols of Soviet power were falling elsewhere. Men scrambled to the roof of the Ukrainian parliament to lower the Soviet flag. Crowds below cheering as the blue and yellow banner of independent Ukraine was hoisted. As Mr. Gorbachev left the Kremlin tonight, he remained the Soviet president. But his victory at the Congress further eroded his own authority.
Nobody knows what kind of functions the republics will give to him. Now he's in position of constitutional monarch, I think.
Today's momentous events may have set the seal on the past, but the future is no less secure. Political will has created structures which exist only in outline. Giving them the strength to support a new union will be the hardest task of all. Tim Hewitt, News at 10, Moscow.
As the Soviet Union and its republics break apart, ethnic groups within the republics are seizing their chance for power too. Many ethnic regions within Mr. Boris Yeltsin's Russian Republic don't want to be run by the Russian parliament. One is Tatarstan. For 6 centuries, it covered much of what is Russia today. Tatarstan now says it will declare independence from Russia at the end of the month.
Tatarstan. The Muslim nationalists here call it the country the world forgot. With the dismemberment of the Soviet Union, it's not just the republics, but also the ethnic groups who are struggling for independence in what's become a power vacuum. The Tatars have preserved their religion, their culture, their language, despite centuries of domination, first by Tsarist Russia, then by the Soviet Union. The repression of their Muslim faith has ended, and at this funeral service, the bodies prepared according to Tatar traditions, a local leader implores his followers to help revive their heritage. It was from the fortress city of Kazan that the powerful Tatar Empire emerged in the 9th century, until it was crushed by Tsar Ivan the Terrible in 1552. But astonishingly, 439 years later, Tatar nationalism is again resurgent. Local leaders like Marat Mulyukov claim the Tatar case is little different from that of the Baltic states. We want to be a free people, he declares, and our main aim is full political and economic sovereignty. And yes, that does mean we want a seat at the United Nations as an independent country. Traditionally, this has been a hard-line communist region. The statue of Lenin remains untouched, and the president of Tatarstan even supported the coup attempt. But most local people want to break away from Moscow, and with communism collapsing, the old party leadership is now adopting nationalism to retain a power base among workers. Even the communist vice president told ITN he now backs independence. Many Tatars believe that the Soviet Empire is now being replaced by a Russian one, and the hero of Moscow, Boris Yeltsin, is seen here as something of a villain for his disregard of Tatar independence. One reason is economic. Yeltsin knows that Tatarstan is a vital region in his Russian Republic, a key port on the Volga, the junction from Moscow to the Urals. Tatar independence would also suggest that Russia itself, and not just the Soviet Union, is in danger of disintegration. Robert Moore, News at 10, Tatarstan.
A task force of British supermarket and food company bosses is going to the Soviet Union to help them sort out their food distribution problems. The Minister of Agriculture, Mr. John Gummer, said they will leave by the end of the month at the latest. Some have conceded they have an eye on eventually setting up supermarkets there.
The Soviet Union may be changing politically, but food distribution remains chaotic. These Muscovites have to travel an hour away to get fresh fruit. It is available in the city, but unregulated traders are profiteering. This woman bought her grapes for 2 rubles a kilo and is selling them for 20 rubles. Without foreign aid and expertise, economists fear inflation could reach 1,000%. These sausages illustrate the problem. They were brought 600 miles to Moscow in unrefrigerated lorries, basic hygiene is ignored, and when they arrived, they were further delayed by bureaucracy. By the time this meat gets into the shops, no one will know for certain if it's really fit to eat. A contrasting scene, a luxury London hotel, was the setting for John Gummer's meeting today with 50 leaders of British industry, discussing their plans to help the republics feed themselves.
We'll be having pilot projects which will set the example of training to other people. We'll be bringing people over here to train. We'll be sending experts over there for short periods, and some people to be there side by side with people for longer periods.
British expertise in distribution could prove most useful in ending the terrible wastefulness in the Soviet Union, where half of last year's harvest rotted before it reached the shops.
We actually move 6 million cases through our distribution centres every week, and we have direct links with growers, food manufacturers and producers around the world. So what the Minister's trying to do is to put forward a team that's got this general experience in avoidance of waste, scheduling, good practices.
The British will also advise on retailing skills. Soviet economists, while grateful, believe they have to solve the crisis for themselves.
We are very grateful to everybody who wished to help us, but I think that it's impossible to solve our problems through aid, and only we ourselves can help ourselves.
Shops in the Soviet Union remain short of food, but by offering help now, British businessmen hope to increase Anglo-Soviet trade in the future. And British supermarket chains hope to move into the Soviet Union to transform these empty shelves into British-style, high-volume retail outlets. Glenn O'Glaser, News at 10, Central London.
And we're now going back to our main story, the attempts today by Mr. Major.
In 1918, Lenin said, if we lose the Ukraine, we lose our head. Now the Ukraine is having its revenge. Lenin is losing his. His statue in Kiev is coming down, a symbolic end to Soviet communism and for the Ukraine to the endless rule of Russia. That, anyway, is the Ukrainian hope, for Big Brother Russia has always had the upper hand. 2 Saturdays ago, the Ukrainian parliament voted for independence, as other Soviet republics have been doing. It was a step into the unknown. The Ukraine has never really been its own master. The declaration is to be put to a referendum on the 1st of December, and the answer will be an overwhelming yes, to judge by immediate popular reaction. A new European nation of 52 million people, a country the size of France, is winning free, and not before time. After 1917, the Ukraine, or anyway the bulk of it, passed like a parcel from Tsarist Russia to the new Soviet Union. There was some spirited squabbling, but the Soviets won the day. Stalin then wished upon this fertile land the bleakest period in its history. Forced collectivization of agriculture beginning in 1930, followed by a genocidal famine inflicted by Stalin to bring Ukrainians to heel. Cost the land at least 6.5 million dead, a quarter of its rural population. The Ukraine, as one writer put it, was like one vast Belsen. In World War II, just a few years on, it was a battleground, overrun by the Germans, then won back by the Soviets, with black tales of anti-Semitism and collaboration with the Nazis to be set against stories of heroic guerrilla resistance. Ukraine and the Ukrainians were torn asunder. After living for centuries in the shade of Mother Russia, the Ukraine tries now to assert its identity. School children a year ago, for the first time, began term wearing traditional dress. They sang the Ukrainian anthem. The national flag was permitted. Ukrainian rather than Russian became the priority language. Still only in towns and villages where the democratic opposition was in command. But a new era had begun, and last year the Democrats swept the board in the West Ukraine and its capital Lvov. Vyacheslav Chornovil led them to victory. This is Catholic country, unlike Central and East Ukraine, where the Russian Orthodox Church is dominant. Chornovil is a journalist who spent 15 years in Soviet prisons for advocating Ukrainian sovereignty. He was chosen this week by Ukraine's nationalist movement to be its presidential candidate in December. An articulate man of 53, matured in the Gulag, a sort of Ukrainian Václav Havel.
He is a very good leader, very good organizer, and in some ways similar to Boris Yeltsin, a populist. But at the same time, he has good, strong democratic and credentials, and he's known both in Ukraine for organizing the local regional council, privatizing land and factories, and so he has a good track record.
The man he seeks to unseat is Leonid Kravchuk, who's running the Ukraine at the moment, one of the new breed of communist turncoats who today finds himself courted by the Western world. Kravchuk has just banned his own party, engineered independence, backtracked into an agreement with Russia, and generally stood the old communist-run Ukraine on its head. A political fox, Mr. Kravchuk. Ukrainian nationalists resent his wily donning of their clothes.
Really, Kravchuk is a transient figure, and he's a figure on the way out, as is the Ukrainian parliament and the parliament in Moscow of the All-Union Supreme Soviet. These are all people who were elected in 1989, 1990, who really today have no popular mandate to represent anybody.
Whether Ukrainians choose to be run by an independent nationalist or by an old communist who's seen the light, we won't know until December, when Vyacheslav Chornovil faces Leonid Kravchuk at the polls. The outcome could determine how closely an independent Ukraine will be wedded to Russia. That relationship is crucial. It always has been, like that of Slovakia and Bohemia or of Scotland and England. Ukrainian national consciousness has had a rough ride at the hands of Moscow, so Boris Yeltsin and his merry men are a little panicky now at the prospect of losing their Slav neighbour. The Ukraine feeds them after all. It is the Soviet Union's granary and a net exporter of foodstuffs. Given a chance with abolition of collectives and state farms, all woefully inefficient, the Ukraine's farmers in a few years could come up trumps. Some months ago, the Ukraine took a cheeky leap towards economic self-sufficiency, issuing coupons which effectively shut non-Ukrainians out of the market. It was the first step towards a separate currency, which Mr. Kravchuk has already had printed. The Ukraine's biggest lack is energy. It has little oil of its own and has to import from Russia. So that gives Big Brother to the east a degree of leverage. Economically, though, each would seem to need the other.
In terms of economic power, which is going to be the most important in the future, I can't envisage Russia would dominate Ukraine because Russia, yes, it does have oil reserves, although Ukraine also has it. But Ukraine has food. And as the mayor of Leningrad said last week in Kiev, how can Ukraine become independent? Who's going to feed us?
The Ukraine is rich in minerals, coal, manganese and iron ore, to name but three, and an industrial power on its own, so independence is promising. A potential drawback is that many of its major products are in surplus in the Western world. And there is another problem, particularly in these eastern mining regions, an ethnic problem. Here, Russians predominate. 1 in 5 of Ukrainian inhabitants overall is a Russian. Scope then for added Moscow arm twisting, though times perhaps have changed.
5 years ago, I would have said that the coal miners of the Donbass would not agree to an independent Ukraine. But since they have become estranged from the central government in the course of their recent strikes, since the coal industry has been taken over by the Ukrainian government and a new agreement has been made with the coal miners, I believe that the Donbass, its coal miners, its steel workers, do see the solution to their economic problems, their political future in Kiev and not in Moscow.
History has not dealt kindly with the land of the Cossack. Stalin's Ukrainian bloodletting in the 1930s was one of the great unsung butcheries of the century, so a little optimism does not come amiss.
Well, after all these extraordinary events in the Soviet Union, there's no mistaking the triumphalist mood in Washington as the communist system collapses. But what about the health of democracy closer to home? Why is it that one of the two major American political parties appears incapable of finding a candidate of any stature to run in the forthcoming presidential election? By this time in the 1988 campaign, the Democrats had 7. This time they have just 1 officially declared candidate, while a host of well-known Democrats...
What's wrong with him today? I don't know. You don't think he's up to something, do you?
No. I think he just wants to look after us.
It's very sweet of him, but I think maybe he's trying a bit too hard.
Right. Back to the shops. Stefan, you don't sound very Ukrainian.
Well, of course I was born here, but I have Ukrainian parents, and my father taught me the language. And, well, I really feel Ukrainian.
Are there a lot of Ukrainians living around here?
We've about 1,000 to 2,000 people in the community around here. And, of course, they come here to participate in the events at the community centre.
What kind of events go on here?
We have lots of social events that take place here, but in particular, Ukrainian singing and dancing. And at present, we're on the run-up to Easter. And particularly the children, they're learning about Easter traditions at the present moment.
I believe you have a tradition of really special foods at Easter.
Yes, we have a large variety of foods, in particular eggs. We have a thing called the pisanka, which is a beautifully decorated egg, and which is traditional to all Ukrainians. And in particular, we try to pass this tradition on to our children. Hotoish! Dobry dzień, Haleno.
Dobry dzień.
These are the pisanki I was telling you about. The finished article.
They're gorgeous, aren't they?
Yeah, great.
And this is Helena, the expert.
Hi.
How do you go about making these, Helena?
By using beeswax and kiska. First of all, what we do is use a white egg, never a brown, because white will bring out the colours and make it brighter. So we take a white egg and we pencil our outlines on it so it's easier to follow. And then we heat the kiska into the centre of the flame. When you've had it there for a couple of minutes, dip it into the beeswax. When the wax starts to melt, take it out and gently use it as a pen, go over your pencil lines. When you go over them, you actually seal the colour of the egg, and then we immerse it in a dye. First of all, you always start with your lightest colour and work your way up to the black. The triangles symbolise the Father, Son and the Holy Ghost. The stars, eternal life, and the ferns, strength and stamina. All the colours are connected to Easter. Yellow signifies light. Green, spring and new life. And the black is the darkest hour, Christ's darkest hour.
£1 stilton, please.
Can I have 3 of those, please?
And this is what we do with the eggs. We put them in the koshik, the Easter basket. The meat products are a symbol of Christ's sacrifice at Easter. The butter and cheese are a symbol of the abundance of life around springtime. And of course, no Easter basket would be complete without the pascha, the traditional Easter bread, and here it has 2 little birds on the top, which is a symbol of Jesus Christ rising from the dead and sharing the abundance of life with everyone.
Do you eat the food?
Yes, of course. But we can't eat the food until the priest has blessed it. This takes place after the matins and the Divine Liturgy on Easter Sunday morning. We then, after it's been blessed, take the basket and the contents home, and we share it together with the rest of the family.
Where do these traditions come from?
Well, originally they were pagan traditions and were part of the spring festival that pagans used to celebrate in Ukraine. But of course, with the arrival of Christianity, Christians adapted these traditions to their own use. The egg, for example, for pagans, was a symbol of the rebirth of life and fertility. For Christians, it was used in a new sense, not only a symbol of rebirth, but also as a symbol of Jesus Christ rising from the dead.
That was great.
Yeah, I love those painted eggs.
Yeah. We'll have to try and get some of those for the Easter lunch for the Ukrainians.
We could use them anywhere. They look gorgeous.
I can never understand why people have eggs at Easter.
No, but when you think about it, that's what it's all about. New life, new beginnings.
That's the way we need to think about the future. Positive.
I still think it's a bit odd the way Robert sent us off like this.
I know what you mean.
Last time he started acting strangely, he was looking for another job.
I'm sure it isn't that. He probably feels he just...
Can you hear music?
Yeah. It's coming from inside the garage.
What's Robert up to?
What have you been doing?
Well, you both seem so down in the dumps this afternoon. I had to do something to cheer you up.
I don't know what to say.
Try saying something like, Robert, you're wonderful.
Robert, you're wonderful.
A bit more feeling next time, perhaps? Cheers.
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 All this work?
Actually, it's quite nice cooking just for 3 people and only for fun. Now, for starter, we have Oriental soup and Indian samosas, followed by fresh trout with pasta. And for dessert, we do have some rather nice Jewish cakes. Don't touch until you've had your main meal. Now, if Sir and Madam would like to sit down, I'll serve you the soup.
This is terrific. You know, this gets me thinking.
Oh, Michael! No more of your brilliant ideas just yet, please.
No, I'm just mulling a few things over in my head, that's
Well,
all.
can't you just enjoy your food?
I will. But I was just thinking, Robert's so good at this kind of thing, we ought to do more of it.
What, more private dinner parties?
No. Do more multicultural stuff. You know what I think?
This is great, Robert.
I think we should do another multi-faith festival.
Well, I don't think the council are planning another one for the moment.
Well, why wait for them? Why not set up our own festival?
You're kidding.
I'm not. We could ask the council for a grant. That way, we'd be able to run the whole thing ourselves. We'd be in more control, and we'd make a better profit.
Have a samosa, Michael.
I can just imagine it all. Of course, we need a bigger hall, and I do the stands differently. You see, we'd have a different area for different religions. And within those different areas, we'd have different groups. And at the end of the day, we could bring all the different groups together. It'd be wonderful. Well, can you think of a better idea?
In half an hour here on BBC One, See Here returns with a new series starting with a comparative study of television.
A zásadne s nasadením ochranných prostriedkov.
In Czechoslovakia, they're preparing for a nuclear doomsday. It's not a missile attack that's raising fears here, but their local nuclear plant at Bohunice, 10 miles away. I'm inside one of the world's most dangerous nuclear power plants. A line of these obsolete Soviet-designed reactors stretches across East and Central Europe. Their safety falls far short of international standards. Just how worried are the experts? Could another Chernobyl happen here? This time, much closer to home. Chernobyl, 1986. The worst nuclear accident in history. Now, as the former Soviet Empire is rocked by political turmoil, its nuclear industry is on the point of collapse. Many of its old nuclear reactors, especially the VVERs, are accidents in waiting.
The VVERs really should be closed down. There's no doubt in my mind they should be closed down.
Our finding was that the safety level of this power plant would lead us to expect an accident to be about 100 times as likely as in a modern power plant.
We made a recommendation saying that it was imprudent to continue operating the plants in the condition they were in.
There are 65 nuclear reactors at 21 sites across Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Of these, the VVERs, Soviet-designed pressurized water reactors, have sent the greatest shivers down Western spines. In this program, we look at 3 of the reactors.
Reactor at the Chernobyl power station in the Ukraine. Chernobyl was the scene of the world's worst nuclear disaster 5 years ago. The latest fire released hydrogen into the turbine room, setting the roof ablaze. There are no reports of injuries or a radiation leak. The judge nominated for the United States
The blaze broke out in a generating room at Chernobyl's #2 reactor. It caused extensive damage to equipment and a gaping hole in the roof. But officials at the plant are insisting there have been no injuries and no leaks of radiation, although they are monitoring radioactivity levels in the power station and surrounding areas. The fire started last night when the reactor, which had been turned off for repairs, was unexpectedly switched on again by a faulty automatic switch. That produced a sudden surge of electricity and flames quickly spread. Officials here have, though, appeared anxious to provide as much information as possible as early as possible, in contrast to 5 years ago when they were accused of covering up the scale of the 1986 disaster at Chernobyl. Then an explosion in one of the plant's other reactors sent a vast radioactive cloud across parts of the Soviet Union and Europe. That reactor is now encased in a concrete sarcophagus. The Ukrainian government wants to close Chernobyl completely by 1995, but many of the people and politicians who live around it are demanding that it should be shut down straight away. Ben Brown, BBC News, Moscow.
A new series of 40 minutes starts in Scotland with the intriguing story of Alec the Pole.
He had no birth certificate, you see, because it got lost. And he had Poland on his jackets and on his coat and everything like that. He's just known as Alec the Pole. And the ladies like him because he's clean.
I didn't think much of him because he couldn't speak a word of English.
Oh, yes, he's got his funny ways. It's difficult sometimes to know what he's saying.
The majority call him Alec the Pole, and to his face, he's known as such.
When I came here, I was a Polish soldier. And it was written on my shoulder there, both Poland. Well, I wore that uniform till it fell off me.
Alec Kravczynski lives in the Scottish town of Granton-on-Spey. The people here find even the inhabitants of nearby Inverness suspiciously foreign, so it wasn't hard for them to believe that it was an ancient Polish tradition that drove Alec to pepper his garden with cunningly disguised underground stores, packed with enough provisions to supply the entire town of Granton in the unlikely event of a famine. For 47 years, the people here have known him as Alec the Pole. What they did not know, and his daughter, Val, has only recently discovered, is that Alec Kravczynski's real name is Alexander Denisovich Kravchenko, and he's never been to Poland in his life.
In September, just after a holiday, as we were showing Dad photographs, he said, "Have you thought about what you're doing next year?" I said, "I'd like to go home to your place, find out where your family are." And he said, "You can't drive to the Ukraine." And that was the first time I knew that I was actually half Ukrainian, not half Polish. Well, I was just astounded. Just took the wind out of my sails.
The prospect of returning with his family to the land of his birth behind the Iron Curtain prompted Alec to further revelations. Soon after his arrival in Scotland, he'd begun to write his entire life story in a series of exercise books in his newly learned English language. It begins in a Ukraine as yet almost untouched by the Russian Revolution.
We were a large family. There was 12 of us, plus 2 of my sister's children. My home was in Andreevka, a village in the Ukraine. The houses were made mostly of wood with thatched roofs. They were very primitive. No flooring, just hard packed earth. Work was hard. The grain had to be hand-thrashed and dry by the wind. We struggled hard, but we were happy and contented with what we had. My mother was very religious. She prayed every morning and had the only sewing machine in the village. My brother Fyodor took me to school. There was a huge portrait of Stalin there, and I did not know who he was. When the teacher said he was our great father, and we must thank him for all we had, I shouted that it wasn't true. My father had a red beard and was called Dennis. Things were happening fast. The government started the idea of collective farming. My father disliked this idea, so did everyone else. I remember they took our cattle, our feeding stuffs, and everything we had. As things grew worse, the school was closed, the village was in misery, the animals began to die, but the authorities just buried the meat. Soon the people began to die.
The books arrived shortly after he told me he was not Polish. In fact, he was Ukrainian. And I read them and I thought, people really should know about this man's life. So I decided to type it up. I always loved him, but he's been through hell. I can't imagine sitting down to a plate full of nettles and candle wax and having swollen legs and the things that they had to do to get food.
There was a house allocated for children whose parents were working, so my mother tried to work and I went to the house for children. Many night on coming home, I would find my mother lying swollen and exhausted, unable to get into the house. We were strictly forbidden to take any food from the house for children, but I sometimes ran home with a mouthful of bread and gave it to my mother.
In fact, before he was 10 years old, Alec had to watch 3 of his family die of starvation.
My father was lying beside a hot plate. He was mourning away, and of course he was bleeding because he was spitting blood. And the last thing I heard him asking my mother, she says, "Starushka, I would like a piece of bread and a bottle of milk." So she went away doing her own and got a bottle of milk and bread, but he never ate it. It was his last wish. He was buried, and afterwards, I think Ivan died, you see, beside me. I think Sergei's grave was first, and then Father in the middle, and Ivan was last.
In desperation, Alec's mother took him and his sister Fania to the town of Kharkov. 2 other sisters and his brother Anton already lived there, but the arrival of 3 more mouths to feed meant that the family was simply too large. Twice they tried to put Alec in an orphanage, and twice he escaped. And he remembers his brother Anton's attempt at a more radical solution.
My brother Anton and I hitched a lift, hanging on to the bar at the back of the tram. We were going very fast when I felt him trying to pry my fingers from the bar and push my feet away. There was so little for us all, I suppose he was trying to do away with me.
After 6 months and close to starvation, Alec and his mother returned to Andreevka. With no money for tickets, they hid amongst the baggage on the train and walked the last 5 miles.
When my mother and I returned to the village, there was no need to carry me. I knew that with every step I was getting nearer and nearer the home which I had dreamt so long.
Now, nearly 50 years later, Alec once again dreams of returning, if there is an Andreevka to return to.
As he grew older, and this last about 3 years ago, he started kind of wanting to go home, you know, if only he could get home. And it was then, you see, that I told Val.
So I started finding the family through the Red Cross. And 11 months later, we had confirmation that there was still some of his family alive there, which was just amazing. I'll never forget the first day when the Red Cross phoned up and said, we have found Fyodor and Natalie, Vekla and Uliana. And I just wrote everything down on a bit of envelope, ran through to the kitchen. And Andrew, my son, turned around and said, what's happened? Has someone died? And I said, no, someone's alive, and that's really important. I just went straight to the phone and I said, they found your family, Dad. He said, never, never. I said, they have. I can't be the right one, because he was never sure that they are alive. And he won't believe it till he gets to see him, his brother Fyodor.
Fyodor, now aged 81, still lives in Andreevka, in a house he built overlooking the ruins of the home in which he and Alec shared their childhood. In the nearby town of Kharkov are the three remaining sisters. Uliana, who first came here with Alec and his mother during the famine. Aged 88 and the oldest surviving member of the family, Natasha. And the youngest of his sisters, Vekla.
Оце ж наша хата була, оце отут. Ми так прожили. Та нас була сім'я 16 душ. А потім постепенно померло. Голод померло тут.
Много прожила, плохого много видела, хорошого ні. Так ми жили. Батько у нас любив випити, п'яний завжди був. От. За дітей не думав, мама одна думала тільки. Треба і покормити, треба і пошити, треба і постирати, все їм було нема. Батько так мало він.
Йому ж, я на скільки років старша, я з 14-го, він з 25-го. Ну, я його нянчила, хоч і оставляли ж мама мені його, саме в поле йшли. Я його нянчила.
Та я ж не представляюся. Я ж не надіяв, що він десь є живий. А хто знає, що думати о ньому було мені.
Війна закінчилася, його не чути. Думаю, ну де ж він? Звісно, думаю, нема. Так же ж, як думати, що думати? Як не слышно від війни, і 46 років пройшло, і немає від його нічого.
Although Alec did not die, it was his guilt about what he had done in the war that prevented him from returning for 46 years. In 1942, the German army entered the Ukraine. Despite the recent famine, they found a fertile land and an unpaid workforce.
The Germans wanted 35 people from our village to be taken away to Germany. Uliana had to go, but she could not bear to part from her daughter, so she took her away with her. Her last words were that whatever was coming their way, they would face together.
1.5 million Ukrainians were taken away to Germany as slave labor. Late in 1942, the Red Army succeeded, albeit only temporarily, in liberating the Ukraine.
In fact, when the Red Army returned, they prowled around questioning everyone. They called us enemies and traitors and said that we should be shot. Those who had worked under Germans were taken away and never seen again. The Lord knows what would have happened had the Red Army stayed.
But they did not stay. The Germans returned, and by many they were welcomed. Alec himself was taken from the village as slave labor. But along with hundreds of other Ukrainians who'd learned to hate the communists, he avoided that fate by choosing to serve in a Ukrainian division of the German army, in German uniform. For Alec's family, it was a fateful decision.
I was always afraid, because seeing me in a German uniform at home, what I thought, that there would be, immediately that the Red Army came to the village, my mother and all 11 people that's in contact with me, they would have been all slaughtered, as they usually been done, because I've seen a few of them.
The Battle of Kursk, which finally liberated the Ukraine. Here, Alec's brother Nikolai died a hero of the Red Army. Not surprisingly, the family never revealed the truth about Alec's war, and the next generation believe he died alongside his brother. In fact, he retreated with his German-Ukrainian battalion, and it was not until 1944 that he deserted across no man's land and joined the Polish army. Evacuated in Polish uniform to Scotland after the war, Alexander Kravchenko could neither afford nor bear to think of his family in the Ukraine. So he married a local girl and created a new family. Starting with nothing, he set up a small building firm, which he still runs with the help of his son, named after Alec's own father, Dennis.
Yeah, I dropped some in.
I took some. I keep forgetting to press.
Only now, 50 years later, does Alec think it's safe to return.
That's it. Yeah.
Right.
I hope so.
You know what Pop Uncle Mike's doing just now?
He'll be traveling to the Ukraine with his daughter Val and her husband Mike. And almost as important as finding some of his family still alive is the prospect of making his peace with the village of his childhood, if it still exists.
I can visualize as it was and where everything is. That's a wee gollywog, no doubt. I'm a bit disappointed if I don't find anything there.
It's just like real television programs, here.
In the Ukrainian town of Zolochev, about 5 miles from Andreevka, the home of Fyodor's daughter Alexandra will be the center of the celebrations. Here, Alec, Val and Mike will live for the 2 weeks they intend to stay. And the first job is to build furniture large enough to meet the needs of the new extended family.
А ну, чуть-чуть только, чтобы они парились, как холодные.
In your book that you ate nettles. What would you be eating at this time of year?
Oh, well, there've been plenty of leaves.
Alexandra has virtually emptied her own underground store to prepare for the return of the uncle after whom she was named.
Seatbelt signs going on. If you could return to your seats, please, and securely fasten your seatbelts.
Welcome to Moscow. The temperature outside is 20 degrees, and the local time today is 3:10 in the afternoon.
Fyodor's son, Nikolai, comes to Alec's mother's grave to tell her that her son is finally returning.
Здравствуй, бабушка.
Здравствуй, бабушка.
Спи спокойно, бабушка.
She never believed that Alec had died and was still waiting for him when she died in 1956.
А теперь ты передала, а я переложил. Александр возвращается, знала, ты сама устала. Видела своего сыночка. Бабушка.
What do you want to eat, Bashkats? No.
The overnight train from Moscow to Kharkov will bring Alexander Denisovich Kravchenko back to the Ukraine by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Как скажете.
I got up about 4 o'clock and I couldn't sleep. Looking out the window and see it all in ruin. Trees were grown, buildings in ruin. My God, this is not what I was expecting to see.
Should be over the other side. Should we not be over the other side?
That's 50 years nearly. Surely could have improved a lot. I don't know how. Why did they let it go like that? It's absolutely disaster. I dread to see the village. I'm sure there's no village.
The family have commandeered a local bus to bring all 3 sisters to the station to meet the train. Fyodor, too ill to travel, will wait in Andreevka for Alec to come to him. Alec is expecting to be met by his niece Alexandra and her husband Nikolai. In fact, 27 members of the family and friends are here to greet him. First to meet them from the train is Alexandra's husband, Nikolai.
Alexander!
Александра я!
Александра!
Я Александра, да.
Ой, привет!
Валя, иди сюда, иди сюда. Дочка. И внучечка. Не зря.
Alec's eldest sister, Natasha, is waiting on the platform.
Natasha.
Наташа, там.
Это Саша, это еще. Саша. Саша.
Да.
Ой, дедушка. Самый маленький.
От самого молодшего. She's the one that saved everybody in the village.
Waiting just outside the station, the youngest of his sisters, Vekla.
Oh, dear, dear. I knew you.
And finally, Uliana.
You know me. Ты знаешь мне.
А Саша де?
А це що, не Саша.
Хто? Ти ж Саша. Що, ти не знав? Ти ж Саша.
It's me. Why did you not know me?
Ульяна.
Yes, I know. How could you didn't know me?
Вот я дочка ее. Это я. Это дочка Женя.
Yes,
Женя, это ж мама. Это ж мама.
But she didn't know me.
Да? А, не узнала. Понятно.
Does she know me now? Tell him I am very surprised.
Не похожий.
So many of them never.
Он не может верить, что ты все живы.
Ага. Я теж був молоденький, був. Ну так, був вже молодий, так постаріли. Я не знаю.
You made me cry.
Сейчас он плачет.
50-летнюю встречу Александра.
Так ты ему хоть ситра. Давайте. А ну, вот это да встреча.
I never did expect such a crowd. I don't know, it would break anybody's heart to see that kind of thing. Even the best of times, I've never seen such a layout on the table. Spot.
А это самое летало, да?
А только нема баба нахлынила, да?
Alec had always hoped that his language would return when he did. But apart from the occasional word, it hasn't.
Горчица.
I just cannot, for to save my life, speak to them properly somehow. They all seem to be speaking one language and I speak the other. This what annoyed me very badly.
Two days later, they finally set off to find what is left of the once thriving little community of Alec's childhood, the village of Andreevka.
Absolutely nothing. Look at this wilderness, my God. What did they do to it?
This is the road. Это дорога. There was a well near the house. All the cattle sheds and everything here. What happened to that?
Now at last, Alec will meet his only surviving brother, Fyodor.
Where, yeah. Yeah. Как дела?
Oh, dear God, my brother.
Ты делаешь... Делаешь, что ты не удмит меня.
Так, надо.
Не знаешь меня?
Да я не знаю.
Ну? Не знаешь меня?
Да забудь.
What did he say?
He says he forgot already. He can't recognize.
Oh, you don't know me then?
Не знаете вы его?
Не.
No. Я Сашко. Понимаешь? Remember Сашко?
Помните Сашко?
Да помню, конечно, помню.
He remembers that Sashko was his brother.
Maybe dearly Natasha.
what you're doing just now.
Did you remember you?
This is a place where I used to find my mother. She lying, couldn't get in the door. She was hungry and swollen. And I used to bring her up at the bread with the horse, finish and feather.